all can make it. I'm Rachel Simon-Kurtz. I'm a librarian at the Wayland Public Library. I'm here as this book launch for the Tumbling Sisters kicks off the Wayland Summer Read. What's the Wayland Summer Read class? This is a new program at the library. Kind of like a summer reading program for children to inspire them to keep reading when school is in session. But there's been some buzz in the library world about doing summer reading programs for adults. And I kind of thought it was an interesting idea and put it back to my mind. That is until I saw Juliette speak at the Wayland Library as part of the Wayland Author Fair this spring. I was so intrigued by the Tumbling Sisters. I knew that this was a book that I really wanted to read. I had read Juliette's first 3 books, but when she talked about this book, historical fiction, I knew it was my kind of book. I love historical fiction. So what I wanted to do was, I have to admit, I wanted to give this book as wide an audience as possible because our presentation, although very brief, was very interesting. So it goes without saying that I'm very excited that the Tumbling Sisters is the Wayland summer read and the first ever that we've had. So for our summer read, what we're planning to do is provide a common community reading experience, followed by a book discussion in September, on Sunday, September 18th, and I hope you'll join us for that after you've read the book and have lots of questions. I'm sure for many of you, Juliette Fay needs no introduction. I suspect I'm in the room full of a lot of her closest friends. But for those who don't, Juliette is a resident of Wayland and a lifelong storyteller. She's a gifted storyteller. She started writing at an early age, although it may have been in journals. Her career path was in human services, and she acquired a master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, which means she's a compassionate and a smart woman. When Juliette's children were young, she took some time off for her career, which she always thought she'd return to. But it was during this time that she read what she called a really bad book. I don't have to tell that story. And she wondered if she could write something better. And I think it's safe to say that she did. Her first book, Shelter Me, was designated one of 10 best works of fiction in 2009 by the Massachusetts Center for the Book, and was a Good Housekeeping book pick. Her second book, Deep Down True, I'm sure you've read many of these books, but I feel the need to mention some of these awards because they're pretty good. Deep Down True was shortlisted for the Women's Fiction Award of the American Library Association. And her third book, The Shortest Way Home, was chosen one of the Library Journal's top 5 books of 2012 for women's fiction. The Tumbling Sisters promises to delight as well. Publishers Weekly says, quote, with humor, affection, ambition, and a talent for weaving in history, Faye brings the world of 1910s vaudeville vividly to life through the travails of the tenacious Turner family. It is my pleasure to introduce Juliette Fay.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm so grateful to the Wayland Public Library for choosing the Tumbling Sisters, and so very thrilled and impressed with their organizational skills. Rachel has been fantastic to work with. You know, it's a tiny little library, too small, for a small town. There's that plug, honey. You were waiting for that, right? Where are you? But they really think big, so I'm very grateful. I'm also really grateful to all of you for being here. I know June is a crazy, crazy month. This is my first time sort of doing this, so it's going to take me a second to get all the, everything going. But it's really nice to be doing this presentation for the first time for a hometown crowd. So thank you for that. All right, let me just get this going. And this is a newsletter sign up. I send out a newsletter about 4 times a year if I can make myself. So it will not clog your inbox. I'm just going to send it around if you want to sign up for it. You do not have to. But if you do, I'm going to be raffling off 3 cookbooks that I helped to write. So if your name is on the list, you may be a winner. But no pressure.
We're already on the list.
Yeah, just sign up. I have to say that writing this book was really a leap off the cliff for me. I've always loved historical fiction, but I always thought you needed like a history degree to write it. The problem that I was having was after my last book, I was really coming up dry for ideas. My experience in the past with writing books is that I'm finishing one and there's a story for another one sort of simmering out there waiting for me to bring it to a full boil. And that really didn't happen after the last one. So I have to thank my dad, John Dacey. Dad, wave. That's the guy. For inspiring the Tumbling Turner sisters. Dad came over for lunch one day and I told him I was, sort of struggling, and he said, he's got some ideas. So he says to me, dads are like that, right? So he says, I know, I really think you should write about a book about President Lincoln. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, the competition for that one, like how am I can't do President Lincoln. And then his next idea was that I should write a book about Oliver Cromwell's violent domination of Ireland. Which, as you may or may not know, started off as a tragic bloodbath and went downhill from there. It's pretty sure I'd be pretty depressed after I wrote that book. But as he was talking, and he was talking about how his own Irish ancestors came here to avoid English repression and the Irish famine, something popped into my head, and it was an email that he had forwarded to me from one of his cousins, and it was a picture of his great-grandfather dancing on stage in vaudeville in the early 1900s. So that's him on the right, sort of peeking out from under his hat. That's great-grandpa Fred Delorme. And those are his dancing shoes that one of Dad's cousins found for me in a trunk somewhere and took a picture of them and sent them. So those are like 100-year-old dancing shoes. So I need to thank my father for setting my brain on fire that day. And I also want to send up a prayer of thanks to Fred Delorme. And I named a character after him in the book. The book is not the story of his life, but I did name a character after him. And I have to think that he would love the idea of being back in show business 100 years later. So I have a few other people to thank. My writing group is here, and it would really be hard for me to imagine having gotten the Turner Sisters show on the road without them. So please raise your hands. Randy Susan Myers, Nicole Bernier, Kathy Crowley, and Liz Moore. These are all fabulous writers. Please ask them about their work. They're so inspiring to me. I also have to thank Megan Lucier. Where are you, Meg? Megan! Megan has read every scrap I've ever written and spent way too much time talking about it on our weekly walks. So I have to say thank you to her. I'd also like to thank my children, Brianna, Liam, Nick, and Quinn, who are at this moment the age range of the Tumbling Turner sisters, ages 13 to 22. Next week, Quinn ruins all of that by turning 14. But their relationships, both the love and annoyance they feel for each other, shine through the 4 Turner sisters as well. And last but not least, the guy who makes my life better in every way, Tom Fay. So let's talk about vaudeville. For those of you who don't know, vaudeville was America's major form of entertainment from the 1880s through the 1920s. And it was basically a variety show. Anything that was entertaining, and I mean anything. Animal tricks to acrobats, comedians to contortionists. Even small towns had vaudeville theaters. 100 years ago, New York had 50 vaudeville venues, and Boston had about 15. There was no TV, there was no radio, movies were black, white, and silent, and kind of a fad. People didn't really take movies seriously. So America was really vaudeville's entertainment. Vaudeville was America's entertainment. Life as a vaudevillian was not easy, especially in small-time vaudeville, which was most of it. You traveled from town to town by train. You lived out of a suitcase. You had 12-hour days. There would be continuous performances, so you would perform as many as 8 times a day. But the money was a lot better. Then the average worker was making about $11 a week in 1910, and the lowest paid vaudevillians were making over twice that. So after this course-altering lunch with my dad, I did about 3 months of research before I even wrote a word, and it was fascinating. I just read and watched everything I could get my hands on, biographies of vaudevillians, analyses of the business practices of the circuit owners. It was cutthroat. This was big money, all the stuff they were doing to each other to undercut each other. Movies about vaudeville, which were actually really bad. Don't watch any because they're all glammed up and they don't really reflect the reality of vaudevillians. There are some actual acts that were videotaped, so that was fun to watch, documentaries about traveling performers. As I started to write, I was constantly going back and doing more research, sometimes about vaudeville or the politics of the time, and sometimes about things that you can't even imagine you would need to know. It took me a long time to find out how much does it cost to buy a cheese sandwich in 1919. Well, it depends on where you buy it. If you buy it at a drugstore lunch counter, which was very commonplace for people to eat back then, drugstores served food, it was about 10 cents. At a restaurant, it was more like 15. So at your next cocktail party, that would be something that I think you should bring up. I think everybody would be fascinated by that. I did pick up a number of primary sources that I went back to over and over again. The Montgomery Ward Catalog and Buyer's Guide of 1919. So it's about 1,000 pages, and you could get anything from a horse saddle to ladies' underwear. I'm not kidding, anything you can imagine. So that's one of the few color pages on the right there, and those are the little real fancy ladies' dresses, and they're somewhere between usually $20 and $30, which was way more than the Turner sisters could possibly have afforded early in the story. This is a railroad map of upstate New York, where much of the story takes place, and I just wanted to show you this because you can see almost every small town had a railroad depot. Roads were very few. Most people didn't own cars. You could get anywhere by train. And I kind of feel like it's too bad we don't have a little more of that public transportation anymore. Very cool way to travel. So I chose 1919 as the setting for the book because it was a fascinating year in US history. There was this confluence of all these interesting things happening, including Prohibition, which was the ban on the production, sale, or consumption of alcohol. It was passed in January of 1919, and it would take effect in January 1920. The proponents of Prohibition thought it would solve both alcoholism and domestic violence. Couldn't actually pass a law telling people they couldn't beat their spouses. That wasn't politically going to fly, but you could take away their alcohol. People who were against it thought 1919 would be the last days of fun the nation would ever enjoy. World War I, the largest armed conflict the world had ever known, had just ended in late 1918, killing or wounding 37 million people. At the very same time, the Spanish flu epidemic blew through the world, late January 1918. 1/5 of the global population contracted the Spanish flu, 1 in 5 people throughout the world. 50 million people died. So by January of 1919, when these things were mostly over, the world was pretty relieved, but also there was this whole sense of what could happen next? On the upside, women's suffrage, the right of women to vote, was passed in 1919. This is the headquarters for the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. Those against it felt that if women became political, they would stop tending to hearth and home, and their children would run wild and unfed in the streets. And as a mother whose children have sometimes run wild and unfed, it was not because I was voting. So things were changing dramatically for women. This really intrigued me. There was just this huge leap, and in part it was because of the war. So many guys were gone. Women were heads of household and taking over places in the workforce like they never had before, and that was gaining some traction for them. One way that it manifested, which was so interesting, was fashion. So this is what women were wearing in 1910. And the woman second from the left is my great-grandmother Nell, who who soon married my great-grandfather, the vaudevillian. So as you can see, shirtwaist blouses up to their necks, long skirts. What you can't see is the corsets that were from thigh to chest, like this. Like you could not move in these things, okay? And by 1919, 1920, they were wearing short sleeves, low necks. Those were high, almost up to their knees. So it was a time of great change, social and political change, especially for women. So in the middle of all this social and political change, vaudeville was this crazy little brother and sisterhood with all its own little quirks and customs and slang. So for instance, we use the term ham today. Somebody's a ham, they overact. So that term came from vaudeville, and it was used to talk about a sort of a poor quality performer who wasn't probably making very much money, and so they couldn't afford to use cold cream to take their makeup off at night, so they used pig lard. So the next time you call someone a ham, you should know that you're basically saying they're covered in pig lard. Vaudeville was a much more open society than the society in which they lived. There was people of all different types mingling backstage. It was much more open for women, for ethnic, racial, and religious minorities. It was less discriminating, basically because the most important thing to vaudeville was talent. So no matter who you were, if you could bring the crowds, you could be paid pretty well and you could be treated pretty well. Which is not to say that there was no discrimination. There certainly was still discrimination. African Americans were often relegated to the Theater Owners Booking Association, also known as TOBA, or the Chitlin Circuit, which was down south. Black performers often said it stood for Tough on Black Asses. And this is, so every chapter starts with a quote from a famous vaudevillian, and this is one of my favorite from Sammy Davis Jr. Being a star has made it possible for me to get insulted in places where the average Negro could never hope to go and get insulted. Vaudeville was also a place where immigrants could really get a leg up in the world. It was so interesting. Vaudeville, 1880s to 1920s, was the same time as this huge immigrant surge in the U.S. 20 million Americans, immigrants poured into America during this time period, which was a 15% increase in our population, which is huge. So there was, huge competition for jobs, mostly manual labor, not much chance to better yourself. But native-born Americans, middle and upper class, they kind of looked down their noses at performing. It was considered kind of sleazy. So immigrants, it was a way for immigrants to really get a leg up in the world. Many stars were immigrants or children of immigrants. The Marx Brothers, Fanny Brice, Milton Berle, George Burns, Jack Benny, Sophie Tucker. So one of the most fun parts of writing this book for me was sort of coming up with the kaleidoscope of characters the girls would meet at every stop along the way. And I really wanted to, be true to vaudeville and the time. And so I patterned some of the characters in the book from iconic vaudevillians. So George Burns and Gracie Allen. Fred DeLorme, the character I named after my great-grandfather, has what's called a dance and patter act with his partner. They did a soft shoe and told unbelievably corny jokes. And that was patterned after George Burns and Gracie Allen. There's an African-American tap dancer named Tippity Tap Jones who's patterned after Bill Bojangles Robinson. And there's a comedy team, a Jewish comedy team patterned after Weber and Fields. And in the spirit of joke stealing, that was just totally prevalent in vaudeville, I stole one of their bits and I put it in the book and I sort of adapted it. Again, the humor was unbelievably corny. But one of the things that was so fascinating about doing all this research was seeing how much of American entertainment today really comes from vaudeville. Sort of what entertains us really started back then. There is one real life vaudevillian in the story. His name was Archie Leach, and he was a 15-year-old member of the Bob Pender acrobatic troupe that came to America from England. When the troupe went back to England, Archie stayed, and he got work in the burgeoning movie industry. But by then, he was known by a different name. Okay, oops, I went too fast. Sorry. Cary Grant. So Cary's in the book. I also decided that I wanted all of the theaters that the girls played in to be real theaters that were still in existence today. And when I decided that, I had no idea what a challenge I was setting up for myself, because so many of them have been torn down and have been turned into movie houses. So this is the Stone Theater in Binghamton, New York, where my great-grandfather played. It was considered a really nice vaudeville house. So when I asked my dad about it, Dad grew up in Binghamton, he had never heard of the Stone Opera House. He knew it as a Riviera movie theater. So we actually, that's it in 1905. It was built in 1892. And I took this picture in 2015. And as you can probably see, it's boarded up. It's really dilapidated. It was purchased in 2012 by a developer for $68,000. And he has not done anything with it. And it's just got this beautiful facade, and it's all crumbling in the back. So that's very sad. A lucky few have been maintained and even renovated. So here in Boston, we have the Boston Opera House, which was originally the B.F. Keith Memorial Vaudeville Theater, built in 1928. I've been inside it. It's unbelievably opulent and beautiful. It was renovated in 2002, and it is now the home of the Boston Opera House. However, the biggest and most important theater to vaudevillians, the biggest of the big time, was the Palace Theater in Times Square in New York. If you could play the Palace, you had totally made it. Like, you were vaudeville royalty. And the triangle of space that's right out in front of the Palace Theater is now called Father Duffy Square. It was called the Beach by vaudevillians because they would lay around there and wait to see if they made the circuit. And if you didn't make the circuit, you were washed up. And that's where washed up comes from. So the cover, here's the cover, which many of you have seen. I want to just say a word about that, and the first thing I want to say is I had nothing to do with it. Here's how covers work. The art director looks for stock photos or already designed graphics, and then designs a cover around them. They don't do a photo shoot for a particular book. I don't think any books have photo shoots for them or have graphics designed for them, because it's too expensive. It's just so much easier to take stuff that's out there. The art director designs it, they send it to the editor sends it to the author either loves it or hates it. If you hate it, you can fight with your editor, but mostly they kind of get their way, right? Right, ladies? Yeah. When I first saw this is basically what I saw, the first thing I saw, and I loved it. I was so excited about it. I thought it was really beautiful and really interesting and just engaging and different, like really different from anything I'd ever seen. Second blink, I saw everything that was wrong with it. First of all, there's 4 Turner sisters, not just 2. And second of all, there was all these sort of historically inaccurate details. The girls do not wear skimpy metallic yellow outfits. They wear black outfits that come down to their knees, which was a big deal at the time. That was still pretty risque. The girls originally had, these two originally had these weird puffy clown collars on them. Like, what was that about? And the fishnet stockings, oh no, absolutely not. Fishnets had been invented by 1919, but they were way too risque. They were like burlesque halls, not nice little vaudeville girls. So I knew that the publisher really liked this cover. I knew I was going to have a fight on my hands, so I decided I could live with it as long as we got rid of the puffy collars and the fishnet stockings. So you see the cover, right? My editor was great about it. She was really awesome. She got rid of the collars, and she gave me those girls with nice dark tights on. And it looked terrible. I don't even know why. Just the texture of the tights does something for this, and the black tights made it look flat as a pancake. So we all agreed that we would go with the historically inaccurate, and I would just deal with the historical inaccuracy police, who I know will come down on me, but you guys are all friendly here, so hopefully nobody will be whispering. If you don't like it, just whisper it behind my back, don't say it to me. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the story. I'm going to read you a very brief piece, and then we'll just open it up for any questions you may have. Is that newsletter thing going around? Has everybody gotten a chance to sign it if they wanted to? Great. So the story of the Tumbling Turner sisters is a story of a working class family in upstate New York with 4 daughters. The father gets into a bar fight and his hand is crushed, and he works in a boot factory, and he can no longer work, and they are immediately destitute because they're very much sort of hand to mouth. And the mother decides that she's going to cook up a vaudeville act and go on the road with her girls. So that sounds like a lot of fun, but the fact of the matter is that the vaudeville could be sort of seamy at times. The business was not always the easiest place to be. They meet everything from starry-eyed hopefuls to beady-eyed hustlers along the way. But they also get a broader sense of what their lives could be, what their futures could be. They sort of begin to think of themselves outside the social constructs of small town life, and sort of what society expects of them, and begin to have a broader vision of their futures, much as America did in the early 1920s. See how I did that? The story is told from 2 perspectives of 2 of the sisters. 17-year-old Winnie is kind of shy and bookish, but a real watcher, somebody who really pays attention to things. And 18-year-old Gert is kind of full of herself, very sort of headstrong, and thinks she knows everything. And I'm going to just read to you briefly Gert's first chapter, where she describes how they went on the road. People who are standing, there's chairs. I feel bad for you. Come sit down. No? You're happy? Okay. Really? All right. Get those questions ready, or we're just going to have dull silence. Okay, so this is Gert. The act. It was Mother's idea, so of course I hated it. It was one of the few things we Turner girls had in common, no desire to perform. We were never the types to twirl around or sing as we hung the washing. Honestly, I don't even hum. Mother, on the other hand, had always wanted to be on stage, but her grand plans for stardom had been tut-tutted away by her parents. Then she got married quickly, very quickly, and had our oldest sister, Nell, right away. She made her bed, is all I'll say about that. I'll give her this. She always had her nose to the wind, sniffing out ways to improve our station in life. Once it was aprons fashioned like a cigarette girl's outfit in a swanky dinner theater. She sewed them in black satin with cinched waists and darts to make plenty of room at the bosom. We hawked them door to door, wearing them as we went. Like models, she said. I had the most success when a husband answered the door. I'd slide a hand down over my hip and say, "Wouldn't you like to come home to your wife cooking dinner in this?" He'd fork over the dollar, barely remembering to ask for change, and I'd beat a quick exit to the sidewalk, taking care to pinch the boredom from my cheeks before I rang the next fellow's bell. Gert's my top seller, Mother announced one night, trying to stir up sisterly competition. No surprise, Kit had muttered. She was 13 years old and almost 6 feet tall, so her figure didn't exactly lend itself to fashion sales. With her longish face and big brown eyes, she looked like a baby giraffe. As for Winnie, I nearly laughed out loud when Mother found her with a stack of unsold aprons behind a tree, reading a mouse-nibbled copy of Anne of Green Gables. "What are you doing with that old book?" Mother snapped. "You've read it so many times it's a wonder there's still ink on the pages." "That's all right, Mother," I said. "Winnie wasn't selling many anyhow. She doesn't have enough up front to advertise their best feature." 17 years old, and she was still the size of an underfed 5th grader. Her face had a childish sweetness, but her green eyes always seemed to be squinting at something. A book, her homework, or me when she didn't get my humor. Mother let her be after that, but did I get any thanks from Winnie? Not a whisper. Aprons were going like hotcakes, thanks mainly to my sales strategy, until the president of the St. James Ladies Guild accused Mother of trying to turn Johnson City into one big cat house. Sales slowed to a dribble. Murderous as a jilted bride, Mother shoved the yards of black satin she'd bought up into the attic. It sat there bunched like a panther, ready to strike. The idea for the sister act came to her like a brick through the window. At first, it didn't include our oldest sister, Nell. She was married and living in an apartment the size of a hat box a couple of blocks away, honorably discharged from Mother's army of foot soldiers. To clinch her escape, she'd just given birth to a fat baby boy who, if he wasn't sleeping or nursing, was bawling his brains out. Somehow he was beautiful, though, I suppose simply because he was ours. A vaudeville act, for cripe's sake. How I rolled my eyes at that. I couldn't always judge Mother as harshly as I fully meant to, though. After all, it was a question I asked myself every day. What was I willing to do to have a bigger, better life? To avoid my mother's lot, captive in a boring little town, scraping for every mouthful. I'd been planning my escape as long as I could remember. What wouldn't I do to be free? Any questions? Come on, you got something. I know you do. Miss Barbara.
So how do you get comfortable writing about a character you might not have any direct experience with? So I guess I'm thinking of the tap dancer that you mentioned earlier.
So the tap dancer is an African American who deals with a lot of discrimination in the course of the story. You know, I think the thing that's so important about writing is you get this chance to sort of jump into the minds of other people. You know, if I could only write a story about middle-aged suburban moms with minivans, boring. Sorry, I got nothing. So it's, you know, it's really our job to jump into the minds of other people that are not like us. And what's interesting is there's this whole new brain science that's talking about how people who read a lot of fiction are more compassionate because you're jumping in and learning what life is like from people that are very different from you, and you're sort of going along for the ride and managing their problems with them. So I think we should all feel pretty good about how compassionate we are. So thanks, that was a great question. Yes?
This being your first foray into historical fiction, do you think you would write more historical fiction, or is this a one-time?
That's a great question. I actually have started something new, and it is historical, and it's set in the silent movie era. And I have to say, I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be so much work. I really don't know if I can do it. But I so enjoyed learning all about this funny little subculture, but also sort of the broader culture. You have to do a ton of research. It's, you know, you have to do research for any book. But it's way more for a time that you don't know anything about. You don't even know how people really talk to each other. So you have to, you know, watch a lot of stuff and read a lot of stuff. But I really found that I really enjoyed it. So thank you. Yes?
The concept of how much the vaudevillians steal material from each other,
Uh-huh.
is that well documented? Or
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. There's this great one from Jack Benny. I don't know if it's in the book. I don't know if it made it. When you take a joke from Milton Berle, it's not stealing, it's repossessing. And they were known to steal jokes from each other. They really were. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm wondering, how long have you spent writing?
Different amounts of time, but this one took me about 2 years. It took, I spent 3 months researching, then I spent about 9 months with getting that first draft, and then another year really revising, tons of revision on this one, tons of revision. It was a lot. I had my writing group. Thank you. Yeah, very helpful. Yes, Dad? Oh God, what's he gonna say? Oh, he's standing up. Dad, you're in front of the camera, Dad.
I just want to tell you that this is probably going to be Juliette's best-selling book, because I come from two very large families, and I have literally dozens and dozens of cousins who are all going to be buying. They're very excited about this being about my grandfather. And when she mentions Jimmy Stein, who was the cousin, he was sort of our family genealogist, and he really loved sending us articles from newspapers that he found all over the place. These pictures, but several others too. And in our family, there's a sort of a famous story that one night after a show, I think it was at the Stone Opera House, my grandfather was approached by an agent from New York who said he wanted him to go on the national tour. And my grandfather went home so excited to tell his wife that he was going to go in the big time. And she said to him, "You've got a really good job in the shoe factory. You're not going anyplace." But I just want to say, for my cousin Jimmy Stein, I think it was so wonderful that he did this. I think he undoubtedly had some influence in Juliette's thinking about this book, and he died 2 years ago of a heart attack, and I just want to say thanks, Jim, for a great job.
Yes, Kathy.
I'm just curious that you did so much research, and I know, having read parts of the book, that there's so much there. Do you ever think about writing more what if not about this family of other kids?
It's really tempting, and certainly, most writers will say whatever research they do, only about 3% of it makes it into the book. And so you feel like you learned about all these things, and you went down all these rabbit holes of research, and then you end up not using it or whatever. It's tempting. I kind of am excited to try something new, though. So I'm going to move on. But I could always come back to vaudeville. There was plenty of material, that's for sure. Yeah. Megan. Oh, Mike.
I was just going to ask you were talking about taking 9 months to write the book. Are there any times where you experience writer's block, and how do you deal with that?
So writer's block. Ooh. I felt like I had writer's block before I started writing the book, like I wasn't coming up with any ideas. I go and I talk to the creative writing kids at Wayland High School every semester, and I love doing it. And it's really fun to sort of talk to them about it. And I say, look, Annie Lamott wrote this great book called Bird by Bird, which they all read. And one of the chapters is called Shitty First Drafts. And I say to them, every first draft is shitty. And you have to just keep giving yourself permission to not be good at it, and to tell yourself that you're just gonna get there. You're gonna revise it, you're gonna work on it, but to not expect perfection right away. I think expecting perfection is what writer's block is really all about. So thanks for that. Thanks for that great question, and I'm sorry about your obstructed view seat over there. You gotta.
We paid for the cheap seat.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Mark.
So why 3 months of research? As you're doing the research, do you get to a point where you say, okay, now I've got it, I'm done? Or, because I would think the research could just go on and on and on.
Oh, it could totally go on. It's absolutely true. It could go on and on and on. And I think it was because I was terrified of whether I could even, did I have a right to do this? I didn't know anything about it. So I thought, well, I'm just going to take the summer to just learn and see if I think I can even pull enough together to do this. And then, but as I was doing the research, I was sort of making notes in my head, like, oh, it could be a family, it could be this, it could be that. What if, and then I started learning all about sort of what was happening with women's suffrage, and I thought, oh, it could be girls. That would be an interesting, to sort of talk about the political stuff that was going on a little bit while, I'm writing this coming of age story about girls. So as you're doing the research, you're getting ideas, I have notebooks full of stuff. And then I continued to do research as I wrote, because there's never enough. You always feel like, oh, I got to know one more thing, so thanks. How we doing? Oh, one more in the back, Kim.
So I was noticing when you were being introduced that, you're on a lot of books for women's fiction. And I think that your books are much more inclusive than that, and I wondered how you felt about that.
Women's fiction. Writer pals, how do we feel about that word? So women's fiction is a tough one. I don't like to say women's fiction because I think that it's what I think of that I write as family drama with humor, but it's something like 80% of the readers of fiction are women. So is it sort of all women's fiction, or, and men also read it too. So it's so sort of excluding to say women's fiction. But I do like to write a lot about families, and that's sort of, so I think with my books, different types of families, different types of situations, different settings, different time. But to me, the family is one of the most interesting things there is. And so I always find myself writing about those. Thank you. That was a great question. Yes, Anne.
Juliette, I'm interested in the tumbling aspect and the acrobatic aspect. Did you do any research on, presumably for grown girls, to suddenly be able to have a tumbling act?
Right.
It seems sort of remarkable to me. So was in your book, is there a history of their having some kind of acrobatic talent?
Well, one of the things you need to know about vaudeville is you didn't have to be good. You really didn't. They were all girls who were, active, and they sort of, when they were younger, they did some of these things. And then Winnie, the book lover, takes a book out of the library, and they sort of teach themselves these things. The library. So what was really funny was I kind of thought, well, yeah, they're going to learn how to do somersaults and stuff like that. Who can't do a cartwheel, right? And my editor is a former gymnast. She was outraged. They can't learn to just do these things. This takes years, So she really, what was great was that she brought the realism to it. She said, they need to, and I said, well, they're bad at first. And their agent says to them, this guy who's interested in representing them, he said, your act stinks, but girls in short skirts sells. So that's sort of how they, and then over the course of the story, they get better. They learn things from other performers, and they get a lot of help. So, because vaudeville was really, they did consider themselves sort of a brother and sisterhood, and so they really did help each other out a lot. Yeah. Yes. Oh, hi, Randall.
So, this has turned into a summer blockbuster.
Oh, from your lips to God's ears.
Have you thought about who would play your 4 characters?
I think my daughter Brianna would play one of them. I haven't really thought about that. I don't know whether I sort of feel like I would jinx it if I came up with it. I don't know. I haven't quite gotten there yet. But I also, well, I've certainly had those wonderful dreams where you say, and then it becomes a movie. So I haven't, but I always like to, once I go to book groups, people who've read it, I always like to ask them, who would you see as the characters? So we'll see. We'll see. Yes, Karen.
I think it's really interesting that you're setting the book in vaudeville. Are there a lot of books that are novels set in vaudeville?
I kind of looked at that because I kind of wanted to know what the competition was going to be after that President Lincoln suggestion. Yikes. Team rivals. Wow. And I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find anything that anybody sort of that I had heard of before. There was some very obscure stuff, but yeah. So I was thrilled when I figured that one out. Okay. Oh, Jerry's got a question.
Isn't it pretty unusual to have someone from upstate New York to get into the book?
Someone from upstate New York? Are you calling out people from upstate New York? Jerry, I was born in Binghamton, okay? Do we need to step outside? I don't know. Well, they were from all over. They really were from all over. And a lot of times it was people from not the coolest places in the world, because it was one of the few opportunities they had to get out of their kind of small town lives. So people would pull an act together if they could, and if they could get their wives to let them go. So one of Dad's cousins said to me, Grandma Nell said to Grandpa Fred, "If you go on the road, you can keep on going." So, Mom.
Okay, I just have to. Grandma Nell, how old do you think she was in 1963 when you were born?
I don't know.
Maybe your dad knows, but I wanted to see that picture again. I've never seen a picture of her in when she was in vaudeville, but I knew her when she came to take care of us when you were born. Isn't it? What goes around comes around. Yes.
Question for you about the process of doing this book. So this is your fourth book. Obviously, the subject matter is different. What was different about the process, not just of writing it, but dealing with editors and going to fact checking with a book that was kind of different in style, different matter than your previous books?
You know, the process, I didn't feel like the process from the editorial thing was that different. Although what was really interesting about it, actually now that you mention it, I didn't think of it this way, you know, I was the expert on vaudeville. So sometimes, you know, my editor would say, well, blah, blah, blah. And I would say, no, that's not actually how it worked. And that kind of felt kind of nice. But I do think that I really needed to do a lot of revisions because I was juggling, you know, it's sort of, you got a lot of plate spinning. You got the plot, you got the characters, and you got this whole world that you know nothing about and you're just trying to get a hand on. So it was a lot more work for me, but it was also really this sort of cool challenge that I enjoyed.
So I have a question. So this book, you've already had 3 books that you've published. So you have a different standing with the publisher. Is it the same publisher that you?
No, this is a new publisher for me.
So do you have to you have an idea and you make a pitch to a new publisher? I mean, how do they?
So mostly in fiction, you have to have written the whole book. You have to have that book spit shine to a high gloss because it is very competitive. And if they see stuff they don't like in the beginning, I mean, they'll read 10 pages and say no. So so you have to have it in as good a shape as you possibly can, and then you know, you're sending it to various editors to see who wants it. You know, I think there's a point at which you know, sort of get with an editor that you really work well with, and you know, you're sort of at a certain level, and you can say, well, I have this idea, and they say, great, we'll buy it. But that hasn't happened to me yet, so who knows?
Did your former publisher not choose to? Did you make a pitch to them? And
I did not. Because I didn't want to. And my agent didn't want to either. So.
Okay.
So thank you.
Can you describe the process a little bit about how you work with your writers since so many of you are here and now?
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh, I love my writers group. I've had a couple actually, and this is the one that I've really stuck with the longest, and we just work really nicely together. The way that we do it, and different writers groups do different things, is whenever somebody's got something, and it can be a full manuscript, it can be, you know, the first 50 pages, it can be an idea they want to run by us. We call a meeting, and then we scramble madly to find a date we can all do it. And then we all read it, and then we sort of come with notes to say, here's what we feel like is really working, here's what may need some work. I think we have a really nice combination of being very kind to each other and pulling no punches. You know, we're very honest with each other. We've gone on some writing retreats together, which is really fun. We just all sit in our hotel rooms and write all day, and then we get to have dinner and chat and stuff. So I feel very, very grateful to have a group that just works so well. So, love you. Okie dokie. Oh, Betsy.
Sometimes there's books where there's a character that you just hate as a reader.
Yeah.
So what is that like to write that character? Like, do you hate the character too if you have a character that's dislikable?
That's a great question. I have to say that I feel like I have to love all my characters because I have to know them, and I have to know why they're so despicable. I have to know where that comes from. You may not see that much of that in the book, but in order to really make a character feel real and feel authentic, they can't just be a bad guy, in my mind. I want to know why they're a bad guy. And it's kind of fun to write those characters too. I mean, you got to have bad guys, otherwise you don't have any story, you don't have any conflict. But I think for me, I feel like I have to know them and I have to love them at least a little bit.
But are you knowing them in your head? Like, you know, like it's not,
They're not real ones,
reflected in the
so.
book. I mean, it's not like there's a backstory to them that you as the author know,
Yes.
but that backstory is not part of the book.
The backstory maybe part of it's in the book, or maybe, yeah. I mean, I think we all know, I mean, you guys would probably agree, we all know a lot more about our characters and it actually makes it into the book. but that sort of informs what does make it into the book. You feel like you're a little more sure of yourself when you're writing that character if you know what's going on with them, where they came from, why they're like that. So, and they do feel real. They do feel real. I miss people. I miss the girls. Now that I'm not writing about them anymore, it's like, I hope they're doing okay. They're fictional. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Lauren.
Do you find that writing a book changes you?
Oh, wow, what a question, Lauren. That's awesome. I do feel like it changes me in the sense of that compassion aspect that you, especially if you write about a character who's really different from you, and you really got to get deep into their heads of who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. I think that you feel greater compassion for people who are different from you. And that's, kind of a great thing. I mean, obviously I'm, got plenty of work to do in that department, but I do think it makes you stop maybe and say, there's probably more to this story. This guy's being a jerk, but man, there's probably more to this story, so I hope. Okay, well, I think there's probably still some food out there. Okay, so I just want to tell you, this is a book that my dear friend, 23, all right. This is a book that my dear friend Randy Myers sort of coordinated with a bunch of different authors. Robin Black, Priscilla Gilman, Jane Green, Laura Harrington, Randy, M.J. Rose. These are names that you probably may have heard of. And we all wrote recipes based on our books. So it's kind of cool. So I'm going to have my friend Liana pick a number between 1 and 23.
Okay.
Tell me. 9. Number 9 is, sorry, Anna Summers. My Irish stew is in there, it's pretty good. Liam, pick a number between 1 and 23.
21.
That's my goal. Mom, you're the last one, between 1 and 23.
14.
That is Jiho Donovan. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. Please eat all this wonderful food that's here. And I will, if there's books that still need to be signed, I'll go back and sign them. And I'm just so grateful to all of you for being here tonight. And thanks again to the Wayland Library.